Welcome everyone. My name is Madeline Jarrett. I'm the Graduate Research Assistant at the Garcia Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 7th annual Wolfe Lecture on Religion and American Politics, entitled To the Margins, Francis, Leo, and the Crypto-Religious 1980s. Before the main event, I'd like to offer 2 brief housekeeping items. Firstly, this conversation will be videotaped and will be made available on our website after the event. So in light of this, please be sure to silence your cell phones. And secondly, the BC Bookstore is here selling copies of Dr. Eli's book, The Last Supper. We encourage you to take a look after the lecture is over. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to an exciting upcoming event we're hosting at the Garcia Center. On Monday, May 4th, we will host a celebration of the work of our director, Father Mark Massa, who will be stepping down from his role at the end of this semester. The reception will take place from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in the Murray Function Room in the Yawkey Center. And again, that's Monday, May 4th. To learn more about these and our other events, please visit our website, bc.edu/BOISI. If you prefer to get your information in trendier ways, you can follow us on social media. And now it is my pleasure to turn over the podium to the Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Provost and Dean of Faculties at Boston College, David Quigley, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks so much, Madeline, and I'll try to be brief here because I think we're all here because we want to hear from our 2 presenters over the next little while. One of the casualties of this winter was the original date for this lecture, and unfortunately Mark Massa, who like me and a few others in this room certainly are longtime fans of our primary speaker tonight, couldn't be with us because of a long scheduled commitment out of state. So I was pleased to be able to step in, but really the work that went into this is Susan and Madeline and Father Mark and the rest over at the Garcia Center, and I hope to be there on May 4th to celebrate all that Mark has done. Over the next hour and a half or so, we'll have an opportunity to hear from both our main presenter and our respondent on a book that really grabbed hold of my imagination, and I know some colleagues are on campus when it appeared last year. I read it in the middle of the summer, but have really reflected on it over the past many months, and I think a number of other folks on campus have done the same. So let me just move here to kind of introduce our 2 speakers and then let them take it home, and I'll just wrap it up when we get to the Q&A later. Our primary presenter, Paul Elie, graduate of Fordham University, is a senior fellow in Georgetown's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker, which most recently published his extensive and really insightful profile of Pope Leo XIV. Loved how it ended with the little Wordle little kind of humanizing touch there. His 3rd book, The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, available just to my left. Here in the front of the room, was published by FSG in May 2025 and was chosen as Best Book of the Year by both the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. His 2 previous books, if you haven't encountered them, are really wonderful. We hosted for the most recent one a Lowell lecture back, I think, in 2013, Reinventing Bach, The Search for Transcendence in Sound, and then a book that's near and dear to my heart and that I've gifted various times over the last 20 years to various young people in my lives. The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, An American Pilgrimage, a work that is incredibly generative and a great reflection on the long 20th century in American Catholic life and letters, both National Book Critics Circle Award finalists. He worked for 2 decades as a senior editor with Farrar, Straus & Giroux and lives currently in Fort Greene in Brooklyn, New York. In a moment, I'll ask Paul to start us off. The respondent, we're blessed tonight to have my colleague from the English department, Kim Garcia, the author of 3 books of poetry and a chapbook. Her most recent book is The Brighter House from White Pine Press. She's received numerous grants and awards, including the Tupelo Broadside Prize, the Dogwood Literary Prize, and the Linda Hull Memorial Prize. The work's been featured on the Writer's Almanac, with poetry appearing in Beloit Poetry Journal, the Kenyon Review, Image, among many others. Between 2014 and 2016, she directed the Cloud Center Arts and Democracy series. Sorry, the mic is not quite working, through which she brought to campus artists and writers for discussions on the role of the arts in sustaining a broader, healthy culture of democracy. Kim teaches creative writing in our English department here at Boston College. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker and our respondents. Thanks for coming tonight.
So, Paul, do you want to start out and speak for a while, I hope?
Yes, by all means.
Let's make sure
My
your
microphone
mic
works.
works. Did you want to use the podium?
I'll speak from the podium, but is this it's falling off. Thank you. Much better. Well, thank you, Provost Quigley. Thank you to everybody who's here. Thank you in particular to Ben Birnbaum for coming, because he brought me to Boston College in the first place. And thank you, Kim Garcia, for the conversation we're about to have. And given that you're a poet and that you know the book that I've written, I'll probably kind of give the context of crypto-religious 80s and the two popes, holding some of the discussion of individual artists and writers and musicians for our conversation, if that would suit you. Just a little easier to do things that way. I'm really pleased to be here at Boston College. Oh, and thank you to Father Massif for the invitation. He's a figure of real consequence in this field, and just now that I learned that he's stepping down, and that's really significant. 20 or 25 years ago, when an earlier book of his, Prior to Catholic Fundamentals in America, came out, it mattered so much that a Jesuit and a person of his learning was bringing attention to the recent past and the way it overlapped with our present. And the door that was opening is one that he walked through, and then I walked through with a glass screen. So thank you so much, Father Massey, for everything you've done. I'm so glad to be here at Boston College because in some respects, this book, The Last Supper, had its origin at Boston College and then some places like it. I wrote a book called The Life You Saved Name Your Own. It was published in 2003, and I did a fair number of book events, including an event at Boston College, probably the next year. It's a book about 4 American Catholic writers from the post-war years, principally Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor. And there's very little of myself in the book. The first person pronoun I appears after page 450, I think. And either for that reason or in spite of that, I would speak about the book at events, and there were always 2 questions. One was, how did you get interested in this? What kind of Catholic are you? How did a person like you wind up writing a book like this? And the second question was, where are the Catholic writers today? Who are the successors to Day, and Percy, and Merton, and O'Connor? And as that second question kept being posed, I found myself thinking there are many really good Catholic writers in our moment, and I've written about a number of them in the New York Times and other places, but that it was kind of what some scholars call a category mistake. Instead of looking for natural successors to those 4 writers, why don't we try to see what actually happened in the period after the one in which they did their major work, and approach the question that way. And that period was the period in which I really came of age as a Catholic and as a creative person. So I started to look at that period, the 1980s. Well, what happened then? I started asking. And the 2 figures in the Catholic world who really came to the fore were Andy Warhol and Martin Scorsese. Warhol had done a series of works based on Leonardo's The Last Supper, and then he died early 1987. Not too long afterwards, The Last Temptation of Christ, Martin Scorsese's film adaptation of the Kazantzakis novel, Greek novel by a Nobel laureate from the 50s, had drawn controversy, first from fundamentalist Protestants, and then from Catholic prelates who joined in the controversy over this picture. So I knew I wanted to write about that, this kind of Catholic controversy in the arts in the 80s. And I got a proposal together, and the publisher agreed, and I got busy. But the book wouldn't really go. And It's a terrible thing when you have your subject, you're sure you're onto something, and yet for some reason the work isn't really moving forward. Is it because I had 3 kids and we were homeschooling them? Maybe. Is it because I was doing a lot of journalism? Maybe. Is it because I was in a new job at Georgetown? Maybe. But in a more strictly literary sense, there were specific reasons why my book was kind of sitting in place for a while. Then the pandemic came. Suddenly I had nothing but time. No excuses left, right? Well, my family, my 3 kids and my wife, all decided to kind of outfox the pandemic by staying up late and binge watching long-form cable. I decided to go to bed early, which was between 12:30 and 1 in the morning, and get up relatively early and grab some time to write before they woke up. So I try to go to sleep with the sound of Tony Soprano's voice come through the wall, and then I'd get up, and in these 2 magic hours before the rest of the family woke up and we were kind of stuck together all day, I would sit at my desk and try to break down my sitting in place book and see what was going on. And a couple of things happened, 2.5 really. Number one, Pope Francis said, well, number one, I realized that I had started the book with Andy Warhol's funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral on April Fool's Day, 1987. It's an incredible set piece, and I think it turned out pretty well in the eventual book. But it was a big mistake to begin with one of the protagonists dead. So, wait a minute, I gotta walk back and make him live before he dies. That may take a year or 2, but having recognized the near fatal mistake I was making, had to kind of unwind that. It now appears at the end of chapter 6, 100 and almost 200 pages of the book. Second thing, what am I doing here? Pope Francis has been such a big figure in my life and my career since his election, and nowhere more so than in his admonition that we should go to the margins, go to the peripheries. And I thought, well, what am I doing? I'm not feeding the poor, I'm not on the peripheries, acts of charity or whatever. But I need to go to the peripheries because that's what Pope Francis told us to do. So looking at my stuck book, I realized I gotta go to the peripheries. I gotta move outside of Catholicism and look more toward the margins where this work that involves religion and controversy is happening. That meant looking seriously at Prince and the crypto-religious aspects of Prince's music. It meant looking at Leonard Cohen, who's actually, the composer of the songs from the last 50 years that are now recognized across Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, as having an authentic religious sensibility. When I realized that Leonard Cohen was writing this Hallelujah and the songs like it in Manhattan circa 1986 at a hotel in the mid-40s, a few blocks away from where Scorsese was editing The Last Temptation of Christ in the Brill Building. I thought, oh my God, no wonder I've been stuck. I'm missing the story. So Leonard Cohen comes into the book. And Salman Rushdie, whom I'd written about for Vanity Fair, his controversy over the Satanic Verses. Turns out that the Satanic Verses was published in England in September 1988, a month after the controversy over The Last Temptation of Christ happened in the United States. I hadn't realized that, or most people didn't realize it, because the controversy over the novel in this country didn't take place until the following February when it was published here. So suddenly all these things are coming together because I'd gone to the margins and decided that my book wasn't just going to be about Catholics, but about people working at the margins of religion and art generally. Then I went back to The Life You Say May Be Your Own, and lo and behold, there, in an encounter with Thomas Merton, a literary or epistolary encounter, is the great Lithuanian poet Czesław Miłosz, describing himself in a letter to Merton as crypto-religious. So there in my own first book is the interpretive key that I need to figure out this suddenly much larger and possibly ungainly work that I'm putting back together. Reader, it worked. It kind of worked, I think. A couple of years in, I could tell that the book was really going forward and that this series of moves I'd made had helped me to solve the problem. But I still had to figure out what happened back there in the 80s. It's not enough just to treat a decade as a discrete moment, the way the media so often does, and figure that there's a kind of 80s sensibility that's followed by a 90s sensibility, that's followed by a sort of end of the century sensibility. Same with Generation X, Y, and Z. These facile formulations don't tell us anything. So what actually happened at that moment that I've already got a book contract to write about, and I've been trying to figure out for a couple of years? I've kind of stepped back and try to figure out what had happened, especially in Catholic terms, but in American religion, let's say. And it meant kind of drawing the lines of that decade a little differently. In my book, the 80s extend from 1979 to 1992. 1979, several important things happened. Islamic fundamentalists took over quasi-secular Iran and took a number of Americans hostage. Suddenly, ordinary Americans realized through Nightline and through the headlines that Islam is a real presence in a way that hadn't been in American public life to that point. Bob Dylan, famously independent countercultural artist in the 60s, known as Jewish, even though he's taken the name Dylan and concealed that, signs up as an evangelical Christian and makes a trio of albums devoted to this theme. He goes on tour playing nothing but Christian music on tour, enraging a lot of his fans. Some of them walk out. And in Lynchburg, Virginia, Jerry Falwell founds the Moral Majority. Moving the energies of evangelical Christianity are anticipating a move away from Jimmy Carter, who had been elected partly on the basis that he was a sincere, believing Christian who would kind of help knit things together after the controversy surrounding Richard Nixon. So those three things happen, and suddenly, as I can see it in near retrospect, we've got a new moment happening. And in that moment, it's not just those things. Larger changes could be felt on the ground in the United States. Because of immigration beginning in the late 60s, this country was a multi-religious country, really, more emphatically than it had been at any time in the past. Christianity couldn't claim to be kind of the house religion in the way that it had. And in some respects, the Moral Majority and evangelical energy was a response to this, trying to kind of reclaim territory that had been complicated, or that they felt was being taken away from them. You also, for various reasons, which I won't go into here, no religion suddenly was a viable position in American society. That would just not believe in it, in any religion at all, and that had a different valence in the public space than it had previously. So you got multiple religions and no religion contending for public space in a way that hadn't happened before. Richard John Newhouse, the Lutheran turned Catholic pundit, decried a naked public square. In fact, public square was anything but naked. It was swarmed with religious dialogue and controversy and debate. It just wasn't happening on the terms that the theoconservative Catholics at the moment wanted it to happen. That's a moment that I see as the first moment of the age we are now in, which I would characterize as a post-secular age, in which religion seems to be in decline and surging at once, partly because of all the reasons I've just set out, and that our challenge of kind of figuring out what's going on involves this confusing mixed signal. Like, the society is becoming less religious, but the religious people are noisier and more aggressive than ever, and seem to have their presence in the halls of power in weird and surprising ways. So that moment, which Something like that was happening in 1979 and 1980. It's still happening today. So this book, which is published as a book about the 80s, is really about the opening moment of the age that I see ourselves as still in. And that has formed a lot of people, the way the whole experience of the 60s and the Second Vatican Council together formed the Catholic generation prior to mine. I was born in 1965. The underlying argument of this book is that I and a lot of other people were formed by the moment that I characterize here. And I would say that our new Pope was formed in certain ways. Pope Leo XIV was born in 1955. That means he's 3 years older than Madonna. There was a certain time in Michigan where they were both in high school in Michigan. He went up to the Augustinian Minor Seminary High School in Michigan in 1969 and finished in 1973. She was going to high school in Michigan, 73 through 77. He, after high school in Michigan, went to Philadelphia. She went to New York, the year of the blackout, the year of Son of Sam, and she kind of took the city first by neighborhood and then by all downtown Manhattan, and then through global celebrity kind of took New York by storm. Prevost went on to the Chicago Theological Union, which was really a hothouse of post-Vatican II ideas in the late 70s and early 80s, especially this idea called enculturation, which is key, even though I don't use the term too much, to the story I tell in the Last Supper. It's the idea that Catholicism takes root in particular cultures in ways that are specific to that culture, that on some level that's okay. That we shouldn't look to impose kind of standard Catholic culture, but we should try to find ways for Catholicism to be present in culturally appropriate ways in different places. So this was a big idea at CTU when he was there, and it was a big idea among the Augustinians because they, ever since the 60s, had had a mission in northern Peru. Well, Prevost went to Rome, and he went there partly to travel and partly for the reasons that Catholics go to Rome. You deepen your faith there, you meet Catholics from all over the world, connect with that longer and larger Catholic tradition. But in studying canon law, he was already preparing for an eventual leadership role in the Augustinian order. The order was shrinking, its profile was changing. Whole squadrons of young men who came out of Augustinian high schools in Philadelphia and Chicago and in Oklahoma City and a few other places wasn't happening in the same way. So the order is changing, and he's talented enough that it's pretty obvious that he's going to be one of the leaders of the order from his 20s, or so people have told me. So he gets 1 degree in canon law and then gets a second. And as one of his friends told me, look, Paul, nobody studies canon law just for fun. You have an objective. In May 1981, there's an assassination attempt on John Paul in St. Peter's Square. And the crowd scatters. The Augustinians have their mother house right on the square. The gun is found by an Augustinian. He turns it in or whatever. John Paul spends parts of 3 months recuperating. Once he's well, he comes over to the Augustinians and pays them a visit to kind of thank you. By then, Prevost hadn't been there when Pope John Paul was shot. But by the time John Paul comes over to the Augustinian, I hope I'm saying that right, Prevost is living there. And so there's a photo of him as a young Augustinian meeting John Paul. It was a tradition that the Augustinians were the altar servers for the popes. So shortly before his ordination, a few months later, he serves at the side of John Paul. He's the altar server. So he's already getting wound into the Church of John Paul, which is taking shape in ways that I'll get to in a minute. But he winds up doing something different, and I'll come back to that. So what was happening in the Church of John Paul, especially in the United States, in this early post-secular moment, the way I'm trying to characterize it? A dramatic shift was taking place. It took place across the 80s, but it was real and we could feel it. So in 1979, John Paul visited the United States. He was in New York. I'm not sure if he was in Boston. I think he was. Yeah, let's talk about that during the Q&A. And he was in Chicago. In Chicago, 1 million people showed up in Grand Park for the Mass. The city stopped. Pavarotti was performing with the Lyric Opera of Chicago. He sang the Ave Maria at some part of the festivities. I was going on 14 at the time, but I remember it as being a moment of particular unity in the Church of the United States. John Paul was young, he was dynamic, he was popular. There was a sense that the attraction to John Paul transcended all sorts of other differences in the church, and that it was a moment of great energy. In 1987, John Paul came to the United States again. He did something like a 14-city tour, mainly of the South and West. And the crowds were still large, and the press coverage was still intense, but it was a very different moment. It wasn't a unifying visit in the same way. People were divided about John Paul. He met with Kurt Waldheim. He'd been involved in other controversies. There was a long-running controversy over the ordination of women. There was an animus against him that was part of the whole mix by then. What had happened in that time? All sorts of things had happened, but I'm going to just single out a few things. In that moment, Catholicism in this country shifted from preoccupation with actual wars to preoccupation with cultural wars. In the late 1970s, the bishops had engaged, American bishops, with the civil wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua. The president of Georgetown went to San Salvador to give Archbishop Romero an honorary degree. Had a commitment on the part of the church that emerged out of Paul VI to the developing world. Well, John Paul, because of his experience under communism in Poland, was deeply suspicious of anything that had a communist affiliation or thrust of any kind, including Oscar Romero. And they were trying to get Romero out of the office of Archbishop of San Salvador, and by other means, before Romero was assassinated in 1980. So the shift from being in support of populist uprisings in Latin America to being opposed to them was felt very strongly in this country. In the same way, there were a lot of bishops in the United States who were looking for a vital center. They looked for it in particular through pastoral letters that they wrote on nuclear war and then on the economy. But this set them at odds with an emerging neoconservative strain of Catholics who had high positions in the Reagan administration and had the ear of John Paul. So John Paul was appointing new bishops, strictly conservative bishops who were focused on orthodoxy above all, especially on orthodoxy involving sexual morality. And these things all overlapped for a while, so that as late as April 1987, you had the largest anti-war rally in Washington since the Vietnam War. And it was against the Reagan administration's support of regimes in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and it was against apartheid in South Africa. A huge crowd in the mall, and people like the Berrigans, who'd been around in the 60s, were thinking that this energy was finally back again. Wasn't really the case, unfortunately. The Catholic peace movement circa 1987, this is from the book, was an explicit expression of Vatican II Catholicism. And the church devoted, as I said out in a different chapter, the holiness of the ordinary. Solidarity with terrorized Catholics in Central America was a portal to the extraordinary. And it offset the hierarchy's harsh approach to homosexuality. No matter what Cardinal O'Connor said about gays and St. Patrick's, here the church was on the right side of history. or so it seemed. That high point was actually a turning point, an end point. The situation was changing. The US-backed autocrats in El Salvador and Nicaragua would soon use state violence to suppress rebellion and retain power. Now that a door had been opened onto clerical sexual abuse, and I'll get to that in a moment, the US bishops would keep pivoting to the pelvic issues, abortion and in vitro fertilization as well as homosexuality. As they moved into the controversy space that the Protestant televangelists had opened, actual wars would be displaced by culture wars, to be fought over the human body. So what had happened there? In Lafayette, Louisiana, there was a first case in which the sexual abuse of children by a priest, Reverend Gilbert Gaute, at great scale was brought to light. This was going to be a big problem in the church. Bishops were aware of it. What did they decide to do? They decided to treat it as a public relations matter and to figure out how to kind of keep it from becoming a public relations problem as much as possible. To say that it had to do with individual bad actors in individual dioceses. Meanwhile, they decided to change the subject, focus on gay people. So at a moment when gay people in New York and San Francisco were manifestly suffering, they became a target for many of these conservative bishops, directly or obliquely. The church, you can see in retrospect, brought anything but compassion and mercy to the gay communities in those cities, many of them in formerly or presently Catholic neighborhoods like the Castro in San Francisco and the West Village in New York City. For that and for other reasons, leaders of the church could not speak readily on sexual matters. The answer was just no, 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 no. So, out of their unwillingness to speak credibly and engage on sexual matters, there was a space where people like me were, how do you make sense of these things? And so where the Catholic leaders would not go, the artists would go. And so we suddenly had artists, not without controversy, dealing with questions of sex in the church. Madonna did so, Prince, not a Catholic, did so. Martin Scorsese did so in The Last Temptation of Christ. He saw the movie, and I think genuinely, as an attempt to explore the question of the two natures of Christ, human and divine, that he'd been taught ever since he was growing up as a Catholic boy in Little Italy. If Christ is fully human as well as fully divine, what does it mean for him to be fully human? Wouldn't it mean that he might want to embrace an ordinary human life, marrying, having children, and kind of living out a life of domesticity like so many other people? Was that so crazy a proposition? In retrospect, and in retrospect of all that we've seen in light of sexual abuse, it seems positively ordinary and rated PG, right? But it was enough to stir up a lot of controversy among members of the Christian fundamentalist right, and then for the Catholic leaders passively to join them. Cardinal Law led the whole animus against The Last Temptation of Christ on the Catholic side. Reviewing the Boston Pilot condemned the movie. Cardinal Law said that if his aide hadn't liked the movie, and the guy who worked for the Bishops' Conference, that was enough for him. He would support that the movie shouldn't be shown in the Boston area. One of the big theater chains heard that, and the release of the film, as I understand, in this part of the country was sharply limited as a result, and the film never found its way. But Scorsese was smart enough to really anticipate this, and one of the stories I tell in the book is how crypto-religious art that was initially controversial or puzzling then came to integrate the prospect of controversy into the work itself. And that's what I think Scorsese, he understood, because of the long gestation of the movie, that the movie was going to be controversial. He understood that and kind of built that in. And the first part, and now I'm reading from the book, the first part of the 1980s, crypto-religious artists, Bob Dylan, Andy Warhol, U2, Leonard Cohen, made their work out of sight, working in studios and hotel rooms. and then dealt with whatever controversy it sparked once it reached the public. The work itself opened space for the lived experience of belief, new forms for religious expression. But the controversy over Dylan's Slow Train Coming and the gospel-themed tours and records that followed, to take one set of examples, had less to do with the music itself than with Dylan's persona. Was he a believer, or wasn't he? So Martin Scorsese worked this out by making a video of Michael Jackson's song Bad in the Brooklyn subway station. And to simplify, Michael Jackson's figure wants to prove that the guys in the street want him to be a petty criminal. He won't do it. They want him to show that he's bad. He shows that he's bad in a different way, by being an artist, by doing the most incredible dance sequence down at the subway station. Scorsese the same way. He's an independent, he's a rebel in his way. He's going to be bad in the way of an artist. He had put in the video something that his team made, a wanted poster, wanted for sacrilege, and it showed his face to reflect the pressure that he was under from the fundamentalists at that time. The Bad video signaled a different approach via the wanted for sacrilege poster that Martin Scorsese stuck up on the wall of the subway station. The next run of crypto-religious works would have controversy wound into them from the outset, as the artists made their conflicts with religious authority explicit and braced for condemnation. Scorsese, fluent at once in Catholicism, in the big screen biblical epics, and in the history of cinema as a sound and light theater of the forbidden, would incorporate the dynamism of controversy into the film itself. Go ahead and call us bad, Scorsese said in effect. Call us bad Catholics. Call our work sacrilegious. We're ready. We're making the work we're supposed to make. So much of the story of the book is about artists going into that space, saying, we're Catholics, we're Christians, we're believers in our way, we're going to make this work, and go ahead, bring it on. We're determined to make it. And I would say that that work in that moment formed so many of us who came of age in that moment. Now, how could it have formed Robert Prevost? So Prevost, he was in Rome. He was finishing his doctorate in canon law, pondering the next move. The Augustinians, at that time, there were basically four paths you would take. You would teach in one of the Augustinian high schools, which are a big deal in Chicago and Philadelphia. You would teach in one of the Augustinian universities like Villanova. You would become part of the order's global leadership, becoming the provincial in Chicago or doing it in California or whatever. Or you would go work in the mission in Peru. In 1987, there was a catastrophic flood in northern Peru. The Augustinian mission was in part of the country where there were still dirt roads, and mountains, and burros were used to get from one place to another. More than 1,000 houses were wiped out. The whole area was impassable. Then, a group of Augustinians and two diocesan priests who were working with the mission were in a car crash in the south of the country. Two of them died and two of them were gravely injured. The head of the Augustinian mission down there, a man from Chicago, needed reinforcements. He asked Prevost. Prevost said, I'm going to go. He went. Most of you know that the mission in his time in Peru was transformative for him. It was like a second vocation, or a vocation within a vocation, in which he identified strongly with the Peruvian culture through enculturation. He went to the margins, in the words of then Archbishop Bergoglio and later Pope Francis. But what did it have to do in terms of this whole crypto-religious scheme that I'm laying out? Well, he'd been formed in the newly post-secular United States. He'd gone back to the old world of Rome. Which way is he going to go, right? By going to Peru, he went to a place that on the face of it was still a traditionally Christian and Catholic culture. It wasn't a matter of multiple religions going on in Peru in the way that there was in the United States. There wasn't a whole media culture of Madonnas and princes and Scorsese's challenging orthodoxy, at least at that scale. In other words, it wasn't a place where the culture war was being fought. It was a place where actual wars were still being fought because of the shining path. Much of his role with the Augustinians for the next 15 years involved finding a way to thread the needle of Christian belief in that time so that you could keep faith with the Church of John Paul II and with the Peruvian people in solidarity with them and their suffering, but in a way that did not align with the prerogatives of the Marxist violent operation that was the Shining Path. He did it at considerable risk to his life, and learned how to speak out both against the Shining Path and against Fujimori, who was the autocratic leader of the country. And prior to about the last 6 months, the most forceful political statements that Prevost had ever made was one against Fujimori, where when Fujimori's sentence was suspended, he'd been convicted of crimes against humanity and some other things. He said, not only should he serve his time, but he should issue an apology to the Peruvian people for all the harm that he's done. Said this in Spanish for Peruvian television. So, actual war or culture war? I can't speak for him, but Prevost opted out of the culture wars, went to a society where actual war is still a going concern. And we can see right now how useful that experience is to him in his present role as the Pope. I wrote a profile of Prevost that was published in January. And at that time, the question that I left the reader with at the end of the piece is, what is his mission? He's a missionary. He's had a series of defined missions in his whole career. Now what's he going to do as Pope? Because for the first time, he has to define the mission as well as execute it. He announced himself as the Pope of Peace, beginning with his speech from the Loggia of St. Peter's Basilica the day he was elected, which he used the word pace 9 times. But the following months had the feel of a kind of soft opening, when he was getting acquainted with Rome, assessing, he's balancing, he's going to, meet with a conservative one day and a liberal the next, and wear the fancy garb one day, and then go to a Roman church and have altar girls wearing Adidas sneakers the next. It looked like he was going to be the Pope of balance. Well, people, we are in wartime now. And this person who has some experience of actual war is now a wartime Pope. And we're seeing that experience, I think. We're seeing his ability to speak clearly, not cryptically, to the people in power with directness and simplicity that are owing to his experience as a missionary. And so his decision to kind of go to Peru, intentionally or inadvertently, opting out of the cultural wars, getting some experience of what it means to be a Christian in a society where actual war is a going concern, is of real consequence right now, and it's playing out right before our eyes. And I'll leave things there.
How's this microphone doing now? Thank you so much, Paul. And you ended with one of the questions I had wanted to start with in terms of your New Yorker articles, because I remember the January article saying, I think we're going to see Pope Leo carry through on some of the things that Francis started, but he does it in a probably less confrontational way, something like that. I don't know if that'd be close. But then the quote that you had from Palm Sunday was somebody pretty plain spoken, and I'm sure that also caused some waves. And I was curious if you were surprised by that, not in terms of his stance, but in that he wasn't, as cautious as he was looking in January.
I'm not surprised by it. Is my microphone working?
No. You can pass that back.
Thank you. So, I've now had the good fortune to write for the New Yorker about Catholicism.
Still having trouble. I can only do this. Good wishes. Should I right off? Any better?
Is this working then?
Yeah.
So, there it goes a bit.
You can also hold up that little lav mic.
Is this working now?
No, see if maybe it got turned on.
It's on. I can
I
speak
think
loudly.
only one can be used at a time.
Oh.
Is that what's up?
I think
Okay,
so.
why don't you stick with that one and see.
All right. So thank you. I'm sorry for the delay here. So I've had a really good experience of writing about Catholicism for the New Yorker across more than 40 pieces now. And the main challenge is never to be wrong. You know, you're trying to get stuff right, but never to just really screw up. But I find a greater challenge, or a more animating challenge, is to calibrate the right level of pressure to put on the material. I think right now, most of the legacy media are vastly overstating what Pope Leo is doing. He is not the anti-Trump. He's not the most important American in the world opposing the second most important American in the world. I think those are glib, useless formulations. But he's doing something significant. He named President Trump for the first time only last Tuesday. In a question from Christopher Lamb of CNN, who's a Brit. He was the only English-speaking journalist outside Casa de Vallejo last Tuesday, which is astounding. And so he asked the question, do you have any message for President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu in this moment? And Leo asked a question in English and answered it. So what he's doing now is really significant. It's, to my surprise, more direct than Pope Francis. I think Pope Francis, his style, his personal passion, his freewheeling character, concealed the fact that he was pretty tentative, especially about Russia's war on Ukraine. It took him months to name Russia in any form. All sorts of expressions about martyred Ukraine without any mention of the other side, or much less saying that Russia started it. So Leo's statements are not clearly anti-Trump. There's another still war going on, Russia's war on Ukraine, that is part of all these statements. But he's clear enough that we can catch his drift, though, and I think that's really important. Does that answer the question?
All right, we'll see how this goes. So you used the term in the book, crypto-religious, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, especially because I take some of the rest of the book as together with what your reportage on the popes. It's bringing this sort of good news that the culture wars, this is how it was constructed, and that the artists caught in the crosshairs of that, who, as far as you make good arguments, had real religious belief, were flummoxed, or their messages weren't clearly pro or against, even though there was a lot of making camps. But this was part of the rise of the culture wars, and that we might be seeing something like just fatigue with it. For myself, I feel like there's almost been a sort of moral harm, a moving away from key things like about social justice towards the distraction of focusing on other people's sexual behavior or things like that, that were coming out through the artists in this sort of mixed fashion, maybe not exactly threading the needle, as you were just saying about Pope Leo, but something more complicated. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that crypto-religious impulse.
Sure thing. That's such an important question because I'm Jesuit educated, Fordham, 1987, and for me, one of the key things I learned from Jesuit education was that you got to define your terms. And I can't believe I stood at that lectern without defining religious. You know, Father McCool is back there telling me that I'm going to get a B-. So Milos used the term crypto-religious. He had to be cryptic about his beliefs because religion was outlawed in communist Poland. He had to be cryptic about his beliefs in liberal Berkeley, where he wound up teaching because Catholicism put him beyond the pale in a different way. He had to be cryptic about it in the world of poetry because there were many Christian poets like Auden, but there was also a suspicion of poetry that made big claims about history the way he did, because many poets were predominantly lyric poets. So he had his own reasons. But in the 80s, the definition that I came up with for the crypto-religious work at that time and going forward is like this. Crypto-religious work is work that uses religious motifs, imagery, vocabulary, and so forth unmistakably, but does so from a position that somehow is apart from conventional belief. So when we encounter this work, we recognize the religious imagery and such like, but we find ourselves asking, what does the person who made this believe? Bob Dylan says, gotta serve somebody, maybe the Lord. Does he mean that that's good or not, or it's just a good rhyme? Then the question that we ask about the art and the artist leads us to ask, well, what do I believe? If I'm singing along with gotta serve somebody, what's my position in relation to that? So the crypto-religious work is generative. It engages us on the level of what we believe, which is a very distinctly different account of what it does than what its critics in the fundamentalist right were saying. And I would say that many members of a whole generation coming out of that period, we are crypto-religious. We embrace the imagery. We stand apart from some aspects of conventional belief, but we know that it's real, we know that it matters, and this question of figuring out what we believe is very much bound up with our whole experience of religion.
I was struck as I was reading just the masterful job you do of the web of influences between the different artists. You mentioned the Bad video, which I couldn't believe Scorsese's poster was on the back wall, or that he'd been involved in creating that video. And you were doing that all the way through, as well as looking at what was happening as the church got more involved in the culture wars, and the AIDS epidemic was breaking loose. So you really weave together all these things. So it almost feels like you could start with any artist and you would be talking about their influence. Unless you have somebody in particular, I was really curious about Sinead O'Connor. You talk about her quite a bit. And as a figure who I thought of as protesting the church and protesting the actions of the church, but you complicated that picture somewhat for me. So starting from there or from anywhere, how you see those as crypto-religious artists?
Yes, thanks. And it leads me back to, I guess, maybe the first piece that you edited, Ben, that I wrote for Boston College Magazine. It was my first Lowell lecture, and it was titled Pilgrims, The Uncertain Journey of American Catholics. It's no longer on the BC website. So when I wanted to use it, I had to beg a copy from Massimo Fagioli, who teaches it every year in one of his courses. The short argument of the piece is that with Vatican II, the church entered history, moving away from an ahistorical sense of itself into a sense of itself as people of God on pilgrimage in time. But that each Catholic generation kind of enters history in a different way. And so that many of us entered history through the sexual abuse crisis. Suddenly we're seeing the historical contingency and all this stuff that's happening in the headlines, and we're realizing the kind of historically rooted, event-based character of the institution. Now, it seems like I might be a long way from Sinead O'Connor, but I don't think so. So, as a biographer or a cultural historian, for me to enter history means to know, you gotta know when stuff happened. If I know that the Last Temptation of Christ controversy preceded a similar controversy over the Satanic verses by a month, then I'm realizing all sorts of things. I'm realizing that basically the people who went after Scorsese actually went after the whole Hollywood community and claimed that they were Jews who hated Christianity or something like that. The Ayatollah figured out it's much more efficient to go after one guy. Then the Christian right picked up on the Ayatollah and said, let's go after a guy who's dead, Robert Mapplethorpe, or a guy, Andre Serrano, who lives in a flat for $500 a month in the East Village. He has no cultural power over this one image of Christ. And so we had these GOP, chest-thumping Christians borrowing their moves from the Islamic fundamentalists. And so they were already pretty good at it by the time Sinead O'Connor went on SNL. But the thing about Sinead O'Connor, she's born in 1966, I think. So when she was 13, around the time a lot of people get turned on to good music, her mother had already played Van Morrison and lots of other great stuff for her growing up. But suddenly, Sinead O'Connor, a certain new record rocks her world. Slow Train Coming by Bob Dylan. So her introduction to Dylan was through the Christian stuff. That was the foundational one. She loved it. It spoke to her own incipient Christo religiosity. Time passes, but not so much time. She became a star very young. She was pregnant, had a child, and became a global star by the time she was 21, I think, 1986, 1987, The Lion and the Cobra. The title of that record comes from Psalm 98. The lion and the cobra shall lie down together, something like that. So, if you know when stuff happened, you can suddenly understand her a lot better, knowing that Slow Train Coming was foundational for her. Skip forward a couple of years, and she's on SNL. She's already turned them down once. She's now booked to do it again. Her follow-up to the record that she had out wasn't doing well in the marketplace, so she had to really make this thing work on SNL. She comes to New York to be on the show, but not just to be on the show. A couple weeks later, she's going to sing at a tribute for Bob Dylan in Madison Square Garden for his 50th birthday. And the song she's going to sing is I Believe in You, the least cryptic of Dylan's crypto-religious material from Slow Train Coming from that whole period. It's a classic love song it could be a love song to a lover or to God, like Otis Redding and Sam Cooke and other people have done. It's an incredible song. So she's there on a double mission, to sing a song about belief in tribute to Bob Dylan and to be on SNL. But should I go on? I mean, this is a story I tell in the book. But she's got some time to hang around. She's hanging around Cafe St. Dinfina, which was on St. Mark's Place. It's an Irish place, but she doesn't like to drink. So she sits outside drinking coffee and smoking. There are these Rastas across the street who run a place, and she befriends them. And they've got some antique papal stuff that the Rastas have as part of their rhetoric, at least that group anyway. And then one of them somehow involved in drug dealing, and he says to her matter-of-factly, look, Sinead, I'm going to be killed on Monday, so take my coat. She takes his big leather coat. She thinks, this is crazy. This guy's telling me he's going to be wiped out on Monday. And he's just treating it so matter-of-factly. So she's really stressed out about this. They're her new friends. It's Friday night. She's got to get back to the Chelsea Hotel where she's staying on the other side of town to get some sleep before SNL. And then the cab driver makes a move on her in the cab. She extricates herself from that. She really can't sleep that night. She's pacing the Chelsea Hotel. She's all strung out. Her friends told her that he's gonna die. He's laid all this stuff against the Pope, against her. She's been carrying around this photograph of the Pope in Ireland in 79 or 80, ever since it happened. It was from her mother's wall. Long story with her mother. She's been thinking for a while. At some point, she's going to tear this thing up. She decides that tonight's the night. And part of the reason is she's been reading a book about some of the bad stuff the church has been doing through the centuries. Partly, the sexual abuse crisis is just breaking in the United States and in Ireland. I'm not sure if she read it, but Jason Barry's book, Lead Us Not into Temptation, was published the same week that she was on SNL, or very closely. Primetime Live had done a full hour about the priest in Massachusetts, the worst of the worst. Full hour with Diane Sawyer. It was finally breaking. She's carrying all this load of this stuff, and she's had a sleepless night. And it's with all that going on that she tears up the photograph of the Pope. And many people didn't even see it because they weren't watching SNL. I didn't have a TV, so I saw it on the front page of the New York Post either Sunday morning or Monday morning. But meanwhile, the whole scapegoating machine has its gears very well oiled because they've already gone after other people. And so the pile-on about Sinead was just incredible. The Catholic League and no hair, no taste, like middle-aged guys slinging stuff at this woman like you wouldn't believe. Even Madonna joined in. She said there's a better way to make your point. And I wonder why. It's because she was on SNL 2 weeks later. So it's all really complicated, but if you really know the history, it actually becomes more interesting and richer than if you take the received version. And that's kind of, as a Vatican II Catholic, to enter history is to enter history through the act of writing about it.
Thank you, Paul. And maybe you can see what I'm talking about, the way that, he holds all these different people and who's on whose street corner and who talked to who, and all this bringing salt together in order to create this arc. It's really a remarkable work. I'm thinking, let's open up to some questions here, and maybe while you guys are thinking about what you might like to ask, either about what's going on with the popes, the connections with this and some of these artists, some of what was happening in the 80s in the arts. But then I did want to ask you about something you mentioned in an email, that these 3 books you see as a sort of inadvertent trilogy. Could you say something about that, the relationships between the 3 books?
Thanks for asking, because John McPhee, the great nonfiction writer, I got to work with him for 4 books when I was working in publishing, when he's one of the writers who made me want to get into this whole racket in the first place when I was a teenager. And he said, look, Paul, nonfiction writer, you're always reviewed on your material. So they write about the subject matter of the book at hand and not what you're doing, in the way you shape your narratives. And I've, across 3 books, 1,400 pages or whatever, have been working in a form of, what do you call it, cultural history or group portraiture? Kind of. I think if you're a writer, and especially a writer of fairly long books, you have to be audacious. So audaciously, I can say after 3 books that I really want to have the texture of life through having all this stuff going on in the same book. Have life and times, lives of the artists and how they affect society, kind of a narrative arc that helps us see history in a different way. You get the feeling of lots of different individual works of art, but it's not kind of moment where you lower the temperature, which is what happens in so many biographies of artists and writers, that the life is what invigorates the work, and there's little like commercial breaks where the actual works are described. I want you to feel the kind of heat and light of the artist and the act of creation, because most books about writers and artists focus on when the work comes out, but it's when the artist is actually making it that the drama happens. So that's a real key. To see Andy Warhol grabbing a couple of hours in his life of celebrity every night in an old studio, it's like the studio he always wanted, an empty space on Lower Broadway. That's where he makes The Last Supper, because he's on deadline. And so after doing filming for MTV, and before going to 5 parties, he goes and he's really into it, you know. So it's almost like opera. I want you to feel all this stuff together, and that's what I think nonfiction writing can do in our time, and why it can rival long-form cable or whatever. You just have to really try to do it harder and better and more intensely. And I've been trying to do that over 3 books, and one has to do with these post-war Catholic writers, and one has to do with the way, in the same period, really, the 30s up to the present, this traditional artist, Bach, was reinvigorated through an encounter with new technology again and again and again. Who would think, you know? But it's amazing. And then to do it with these people, where you can feel like the arts and popular culture fitting together, but also telling a whole different story about the life of the Catholic Church in that moment. So that's what I've been doing. It's religion and the arts and how they fit together in a way that I hope feels like life.
Right. I'm not sure what the best way is to handle it. You're ready with a question?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. There's so much to think about in what you said. You mentioned in passing that you asked yourself how to respond to that call from Francis to go to the margins. And it reminded me of a more recent Boise conference that Father Massa was involved in, that Kim was also involved in, which was about Catholic writers at the margins. And they brought a prominent public gay writer, a feminist writer, and a trans writer, who all considered themselves in some way Catholic writers or in conversation with Catholic teaching. And I just wondered if you maybe would comment on that, sort of where the margins are now, where that conversation is going, and how those voices fit into that same conversation now.
Thank you. So is the question, how do the gay and feminist and trans writers fit in, or where do I see the margins right now?
You can choose either form.
Well, since they spoke about their experience at the margins, I'll let their words suffice, and I'll look up that video. I think that, and speaking in a Catholic context, I guess, one of the reasons that, well, let's say that as Catholics, we like the past generally, and so we're prone to see the past as predictive of the future in important ways, but often it isn't. So the whole story of writing, the whole story of the papacy in my lifetime is one supposedly ironclad expectation after another being discarded. Once upon a time, the Pope was always Italian, right? And there was a Polish Pope. The Pope never resigned, right? The Pope did. Never had a Jesuit Pope, right? Until you did. Never had one from the Americas until you did. There's no way there's going to be a North American Pope for the United States. That's the one thing, Cardinal McElroy said it just weeks before the conclave, right? Now we have an American Pope, and so we shouldn't look to the past as predictive in the way that we tend to do, which means that we shouldn't take what looked marginal in the previous generation as an indicator of what's marginal in the present generation. So to get to the answer to the question, I think it's very easy to say that the present generation of young people are unchurched, they don't know much, they don't care much, they're just stuck to their devices. But I don't think that tells us very much. I think there's an opportunity here for Catholics to become Catholics as adults for the first time. The whole story of many generations of American Catholics is people having this kind of stuff jammed down their throats before they had any choice, and then spending the rest of their lives figuring out what to do with that. So what does it mean that the complex stuff that Catholicism involves will be apprehended by people who might have some say in the matter and have the cultural and intellectual kind of readiness to deal with it? I hope that's the margin right now that looks like the center in 50 years. Oh, and where better than at places of higher education like Boston College?
Okay, he brings back.
Hey, Paul, thank you. That was wonderful, as is the book. I'm going to press a little bit more on Leo, because I find him an enigma. And one of the reasons, just listening to you, that I find him an enigma is it almost seems like a lot of the culture that you're talking about, the 80s, all of that, you know, the culture that's so well described in your book, that he would have encountered as an undergrad at Villanova, was almost washed out of his system almost by moving to Peru. Or you almost don't sense him as somebody that grew up roughly around the time Madonna or you or me grew up. You know, I always wanted to ask him, do you know what Jenny's number is? And to find out if he, you know, have the right answer for that question. You know, does he remember the songs? Does he remember the soundtracks? Does he remember the controversies? And I guess what I'm wondering is what your sense of that is. Was all of that washed out of him by Peru, or is it still back there, forming him? What happened to, you know, the fabulous 80s and Michael Jackson and Thriller and all of that in him, do you think?
It's a very good question. To say that he is speaking clearly about the war isn't to say that his personality is any less enigmatic than it was a few weeks ago. He's not leading with personality. He's leading with pretty basic statements of a certain kind of Catholicism that I think is right in the center of things. I hope I didn't mislead about the chronology. I mean, he graduated from Villanova in '77 and did a year in St. Louis. And he was in Rome by August '81, early September '81. So he didn't live in the United States for most of the period that my book deals with. He was either in Rome or in Peru. What we see, well, I spoke with 50 people who know him. Nobody could tell me a book that he likes. He must, right? He finally named one, The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. That's not a book you really like settle down with. So I find that culturally he's a mystery to me. But the aspects of his coming of age that register distinctly: loving to drive, a Midwestern young man who wants to see the world, whether it's by car, driving from the south side of Chicago to Philadelphia, or by getting to the southern hemisphere where so many people from his family came through. The south side of Chicago culture has a strong hold on so many people who grew up there, and he's just like all the others in that respect. The number of friendships that he's kept up, the number of people whose funerals he went back to and got back to, I mean, it's amazing. Maybe it's just typical of Southside Chicago, but he really knows the people that he knows. And he really has spent serious time in their lives and breaking bread with them when he's in Chicago. He's not like a flyover type at all. So that thing is really real. Baseball, I think it's been overdone, but he did get to the World Series and wind up on television. Yeah, amazing, right? And so it's the local culture of Chicago and of the Augustinian order that's his baseline more than movies and stuff like that, I think.
Actually, well, does somebody have a question right away? Oh, somebody does.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I'm struck by like this kind of hollowing out of moral authority and like because of the sexual abuse crisis and perhaps other reasons. and this focus on the body in the culture wars. And why do you think that happened? And also the sort of, there seemed to be some kind of a transference there or something. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts about that. Yeah, that's my question.
So the shift, the sudden exaggerated attention to the body among the Catholic bishops in the latter part of the 80s, why did that happen? John Paul insisted on it in his choice of bishops. He'd written a whole theology of the body. It's pretty impenetrable, I think. And he gave a catechesis of 2.5 years, I think, of Wednesday audiences about the body, mentioning homosexuality in one of the 120 catecheses. Some very large number and some very small number of references to homosexuality. The whole idea of marital union that historical and orthodox and also probably impossible, and written from the point of view of a celibate, presumably celibate man. So it was his emphasis to stuff that was already there, and then the articulation of it by people less gifted than he was. And this suppression of people who wanted to do things more subtly. And Bishop Quinn in San Francisco created the first age ministry in the country. I say bishop, he was archbishop. He never became a cardinal, and that's probably the reason why. He was a Paul VI bishop, and he wanted the kind of pastoral flexibility on sexual matters that several decades later Francis practiced. Just beginning to answer the question. And then I do think that the pressure of the knowledge that a vast and unpredictable crisis was awaiting the bishops led them to kind of stick with what they knew. Like, this is not the time to go into new territory and figure out a pastoral approach to gay people. Let's hold our line and just keep repeating it and hope that all this bad shit doesn't turn out even worse than we think it will be. And of course, it was a catastrophic mistake.
Evening. Really appreciate this session. It's such an intellectual feast, and I look forward to reading the book. I'm just going off of the way you sort of invoked Poland a couple of times in reference, obviously, to John Paul II, but also to Miłosz. And I'm wondering about geography. Obviously, there's a certain American Catholic imaginary here at the center, or more generally, the notion of crypto-religion. And yet, Eastern Europe and Latin America both appear kind of as imaginaries to a greater or lesser explicit extent here. I'm curious, not least because, when we're talking about Francis and Leo, there is that sort of Russia-Ukraine conversation lurking in the background, so Eastern Europe hasn't actually gone away. Is there a zero-sum trade-off between margins in the 80s? The way you think about Eastern Europe, Latin America, right? Sort of Latin America being the hot potato and then maybe sort of fading into the background or being a litmus test. I don't know what the right idiom is, but I'd love to hear more about your thinking about where geography fits into margins.
This is a really important question because the notion of geographic margins, important people have gotten it wrong multiple times, and I hope I'm not participating in that. So when John Paul was elected, he said, "You have called a pope from a far country," or something like that. Miłosz found that notion offensive, not in John Paul's mouth. When his collected poems were published, the New York Review of Books ran a review of the book as if, like, from the distant land of Poland. And he contributed to the journal. He wrote an irate letter, basically saying, like, I can get to Poland from Paris in an hour. You know, how could you buy this communist shit that makes a wall create Poland at a distance when the place is very, very close and belongs to Europe culturally and in so many other ways? Then Pope Francis, when he was elected, he said, "You've called a book from the end of the earth." And that's a stretch in the age of globalization, you know? When I say that Leo went to the margins, it's, you know, northern Peru is remote even within Peru. It's not by virtue of being in Latin America that it's the margins. It's that geographically at that time it was hard to get to. It's a place that many Peruvians, I'm told, never visit or even give much regard. Like the Appalachia of Peru is the way somebody characterized it to me. So that's what I meant. The margins are where the poor live, where the people whose opinions don't matter live, where the cultural conversation is assumed not to be taking place. And Miloš was a very forceful voice against the marginalizing of the Catholicism in his part of Europe, and I bring that out really vividly in the book.
I think we probably should stop there. I'm sorry to stop the conversation, just so we have time for some books. Please join me in thanking Paul Elie.